The 72-year-old veteran's weathered hands froze mid-reach toward the steel trap, his purple heart pendant catching the dying African sunlight. Frank Morrison had faced Viet Cong ambushes, but nothing prepared him for this moment. The massive male lion wasn't trying to escape, he was protecting something. 5 lionesses erupted from the acacia shadows, their golden forms creating an impenetrable wall around Frank. "Doctor." Maggie Thompson's scream pierced the Serengeti silence as her camera tumbled to the red earth. Sarah Beth Williams stumbled backward, her wedding ring, the one she'd worn despite 3 years of silence from her daughter, glinting as her trembling fingers reached for the satellite phone. "Dear God," Maggie whispered, watching the lead lioness step closer to Frank instead of attacking. This defied 40 years of research. The wounded lion's amber eyes locked with Frank's weathered blue ones, and something impossible passed between predator and prey. Time suspended like dust motes in golden light. But how had 3 broken Americans ended up here, 72 hours from rescue, with 6 African lions deciding their fate? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 72 hours earlier, the morning sun painted the Serengeti in shades of gold that reminded Dr. Margaret Thompson of her late husband's wedding ring. At 68, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and hands that still trembled slightly from her last chemotherapy session, Maggie stood at the edge of their makeshift research camp, watching the endless grassland stretch toward the horizon. The pancreatic cancer had given her 6 months, maybe less, but she'd be damned if she'd spend them in a sterile hospital room in Minneapolis. "This is it, Robert," she whispered to the worn photograph in her wallet. A 15-year-old boy with sun-bleached hair holding a lion cub. Her son Marcus had disappeared in these very plains 15 years ago during a climbing expedition, his body never recovered. The insurance money from his presumed death had funded her research for years, a bitter irony that kept her awake most nights. The GoFundMe campaign had surprised everyone, especially Maggie. Help Dr. Thompson's Final Lion project had raised $67,000 from strangers around the world who'd read about the dying scientist's last wish to study lion family dynamics. She'd sold her house in Edina, cashed out her retirement, and hired 2 companions for what everyone assumed was a suicide mission disguised as research. Sarah Beth Williams sat 30 yards away, staring at her phone screen with the intensity of someone drowning. At 45, the CNN freelance journalist carried herself like a woman perpetually braced for bad news. Her dark hair, streaked with premature gray, was pulled into a messy ponytail that spoke of sleepless nights and forgotten meals. The divorce papers in her backpack were still unsigned, but her ex-husband's lawyer had made it clear, pay the outstanding bills or face bankruptcy. Her phone showed 47 unread messages from Emma, her 22-year-old daughter. The most recent one, sent 3 days ago, glowed on the screen. "Mom, I know you won't answer, but I'm getting married next month. Jake proposed last night. I wish you could be here. I know you're busy saving the world, but maybe you could save some time for me?" Sarah Beth's thumb hovered over the reply button for the 100th time, then moved away. What could she say? That she'd chosen every assignment over every school play, every deadline over every birthday, every story over her own daughter's story. Frank Morrison emerged from behind the supply tent, moving with the deliberate precision of a man whose body had been rebuilt by Army surgeons. At 72, the Vietnam veteran still maintained military posture, though his hands shook when he thought no one was looking. The Purple Heart beneath his khaki shirt was real, earned in 1971 when his entire squad had been killed in an ambush near Da Nang. Sole Survivor, a title that followed him like a shadow. His wife Betty had died 2 years ago from Alzheimer's, and Frank had discovered that surviving war was nothing compared to surviving the woman you love forgetting your name. The morning patrol had been Frank's idea, a habit carried over from 5 decades of military discipline. At 0600 hours, he'd loaded his worn backpack with water, emergency medical supplies, and the tranquilizer gun that Maggie insisted they carry for protection. The Serengeti stretched endlessly before them, a golden ocean of grass punctuated by scattered acacia trees that looked like ancient sentinels guarding secrets. "Movement at 2 o'clock, Frank called out, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd spent his life watching for danger. Sarah Beth adjusted her camera lens, following his gaze to where the grass moved against the wind. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The massive male lion lay trapped in what could only be described as a technological nightmare. The steel snare around his right rear leg wasn't the crude wire trap of desperate poachers. This was sophisticated equipment, reinforced with aircraft-grade cable and secured to a buried anchor that would have required heavy machinery to install. The lion, easily 400 pounds of muscle and fury, had worn the ground raw in a 20-foot circle around the trap, his magnificent golden mane now matted with blood and dirt. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered, his hand instinctively moving to the dog tags beneath his shirt. The lion's amber eyes, wild with pain and exhaustion, locked onto his with an intelligence that made Frank's chest tighten. A distinctive scar ran from the animal's left ear to his jaw, giving him a battle-worn appearance that reminded Frank uncomfortably of his own reflection. But it was the 5 lionesses that made Sarah Beth lower her camera in amazement. They formed a protective semicircle around the trapped male, their golden bodies tense with vigilance. The largest female, clearly the pride's matriarch, positioned herself directly between the humans and her injured companion, her ears flattened against her skull as she released a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. "In 40 years of studying lions, I've never seen anything like this," Maggie breathed, her scientific mind warring with her grandmother's heart. She pulled out her field notebook with trembling hands, the same hands that had written thousands of research papers but had never held her missing son again. They should have abandoned him by now. Injured males are typically driven out or left behind. It's basic survival. Sarah Beth found herself thinking of Emma, of all the times she'd chosen her career over her daughter's needs. Would Emma stay if Sarah Beth were the one trapped? The question burned in her throat as she watched the lionesses maintain their vigil. Frank approached slowly, his military training kicking in as he assessed the tactical situation. 6 apex predators, 1 firearm with limited tranquilizer darts, 3 civilians with no backup for 72 hours. The odds were worse than anything he'd faced in Vietnam, but something about the male lion's eyes reminded him of wounded soldiers he'd carried to safety decades ago. "The trap's been here at least 12 hours, he observed, kneeling to examine the disturbed earth. "See how deep the gouges are? He's been fighting this thing all night." His voice cracked slightly as he remembered another young man who'd fought all night against impossible odds, his youngest squad member, Tommy Nguyen, who'd died in Frank's arms calling for his mother. The lionesses shifted nervously as Maggie pulled out her emergency radio, trying to raise base camp. Static filled the air, broken by intermittent fragments of human voices too distant to understand. "We're on our own," she announced, the words carrying more weight than their simple meaning suggested. Sarah Beth filmed everything, her journalist's instincts warring with growing emotional investment. Through her camera lens, she watched the injured lion's labored breathing, saw the way his massive head turned toward each lioness as if checking on their safety despite his own desperate situation. It reminded her painfully of her ex-husband's devotion to Emma, the kind of protective love Sarah Beth had always been too busy to provide. "The infection's already starting," Maggie noted, pointing to the swollen flesh around the trap. "In this heat, with limited water access, He has maybe 48 hours before sepsis kills him." She paused, studying the sophisticated equipment. "But this trap, it's not designed to kill. Someone wanted to capture him alive." The implications hung in the air like a storm cloud. Frank examined the ground more carefully, his tracker's eye picking up details that civilian observers might miss. Fresh tire tracks, maybe 6 hours old, heavy vehicle probably modified for animal transport. He straightened, his face grim. Someone's coming back for him. As if sensing the human's growing alarm, the trapped lion attempted to stand, his powerful muscles straining against the unforgiving steel. The sound that emerged from his throat wasn't quite a roar, it was something deeper, more desperate. A call that seemed to bridge the gap between species, reaching into the most primal part of human consciousness where the line between predator and protector blurred beyond recognition. The 5 lionesses answered as one, their voices creating a harmony that made Sarah Beth's eyes fill with tears she didn't understand. The stranger emerged from the thorn bush like a mirage, his khaki clothing perfectly pressed despite the 40-kilometer trek from the nearest road. Viktor Petrov appeared to be in his early 50s, with steel-gray hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. His expensive boots showed no signs of the red dust that coated everything else in the Serengeti, and the sophisticated equipment pack on his shoulders was worth more than most Tanzanians earned in a year. "Dr. Thompson, I presume?" His English carried no trace of Russian accent, despite his introduction as a wildlife researcher from Moscow State University. "I heard your radio transmission about the trapped lion. Perhaps I can be of assistance." He extended a manicured hand that had clearly never skinned a kill or set a snare, yet somehow he moved through the African bush with the confidence of someone who belonged there. Frank's military instincts fired warning signals immediately. The man's gear was too clean, his timing too convenient, his knowledge too specific. "How exactly did you hear our transmission?" Frank asked, his hand resting casually near the tranquilizer gun. "Our radio's been getting nothing but static for the past hour." Victor smiled, a practiced expression that never reached his eyes. "I have equipment that can boost signals, very useful in my research." He gestured toward the trapped lion with casual familiarity. "This is Scar, isn't it? 8 years old, approximately 420 pounds. I've been tracking this pride for months." Sarah Beth's journalistic radar screamed danger. She'd interviewed enough liars to recognize the tells, the slightly too perfect answers, the way Victor's eyes lingered on Maggie's face as if trying to place her, the expensive satellite phone that looked more military than academic. She began filming discreetly, her camera hidden behind her field notebook. "You know this lion?" Maggie's voice carried a mixture of professional curiosity and growing suspicion. Her lifetime of research had taught her that coincidences in the wild were rarely coincidental. "What kind of research brings you to this specific location at this exact time?" The trapped lion, Scar, according to Victor, shifted restlessly, his amber eyes moving between the humans with an intelligence that seemed almost supernatural. The 5 lionesses maintained their protective formation, but their attention was now divided between guarding their injured male and watching the new arrival with obvious wariness. Victor unpacked equipment that belonged in a veterinary hospital, not a field research station. Portable ultrasound machines, surgical instruments that gleamed in their sterile packaging, and vials of medication that would cost thousands of dollars on the black market. "I specialize in capture and relocation," he explained, assembling a dart gun that made their emergency tranquilizer look like a child's toy. "Sometimes we must be cruel to be kind, yes?" Frank stepped protectively closer to Maggie, recognizing predatory behavior when he saw it. "Capture for what purpose? That's a hell of a lot of equipment for a research project." His Purple Heart had been earned watching fellow soldiers die because they'd trusted the wrong people, and every instinct told him Victor represented the same kind of danger. Medical research, Victor replied smoothly, loading a dart with practiced efficiency. There are pharmaceutical companies very interested in lion antibodies. The potential for human medicine is extraordinary. He paused, studying Maggie's reaction carefully. Perhaps you've heard of such work, Dr. Thompson? Your reputation in the field is quite remarkable. Sarah Beth caught something in Victor's tone that made her blood run cold. He knew more about Maggie than he was revealing, spoke about her research with the familiarity of someone who'd studied her work extensively. She thought of her daughter Emma's wedding invitation, of all the family moments she'd missed chasing stories, and realized this might be the most important story of her career, if she lived to tell it. The ethical debate that followed would haunt each of them for the rest of their lives. Victor argued with passionate conviction about saving human lives, about breakthrough treatments for AIDS and cancer that could benefit millions. The irony wasn't lost on Maggie. Here she was, dying of cancer, listening to a man explain how killing lions might cure the disease eating her alive. "You're talking about medical research that requires live subjects," Frank said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd seen too much suffering justified by noble causes. "How many lions die for each breakthrough? How many families destroyed for the greater good?" Victor's mask slipped slightly, revealing something harder underneath. "Sometimes we sacrifice the few to save the many. It's simple mathematics." He looked directly at Maggie when he said it, as if the words carried personal meaning. Surely someone facing terminal illness understands the value of medical advancement. The trapped lion's condition continued deteriorating before their eyes. His breathing had become labored, his magnificent head hanging lower with each passing hour. The 5 lionesses seemed to sense the growing tension between the humans, their low growls creating a constant soundtrack of unease. Sarah Beth watched through her camera lens as Victor prepared his sophisticated dart gun, noting how his hands moved with professional competence. This wasn't a man learning to use new equipment. He'd done this before, many times. She thought of Emma's unread messages, of the wedding she might never attend, and made a decision that would change everything. "Before you tranquilize him," she said carefully, "I think Dr. Thompson should examine the trap mechanism," for her research notes. It was a stalling tactic, but it worked. Victor lowered his weapon, his pale eyes calculating as he weighed the request against his obvious timeline pressure. In that moment of hesitation, the largest lioness made a sound none of them had heard before, a vocalization that seemed almost like human speech, desperate and pleading. It was the sound of a mother begging for her family's life. The first night in the Serengeti passed with the terrible slowness of a death vigil. They had established camp 50 meters from the trapped lion, close enough to monitor his condition, but far enough to avoid triggering the lioness's protective instincts. The campfire cast dancing shadows across the thorn bush, creating shapes that reminded each of them of ghosts from their past. Maggie sat on a folding chair, her worn leather journal balanced on her knees, trying to document what she was witnessing, but her handwriting, usually precise as a surgeon's, trembled with more than just the after effects of chemotherapy. Every few minutes, she would pull out the faded photograph of 15-year-old Marcus, studying his face in the firelight, as if she could will him back to life through sheer determination. "I brought him here, you know," she said suddenly, her voice carrying across the camp like a confession. "Marcus was only 15, but he begged me to let him come on the expedition. Said he wanted to help with my research, wanted to see the lions I'd written about in my letters." She paused, watching Victor move restlessly around the perimeter of their camp. The climbing accident happened on his 3rd day. One minute he was there, setting up equipment, the next minute he was gone. We searched for 2 weeks, but the body was never recovered. Frank looked up from cleaning his rifle, recognizing the particular kind of pain that came from losing someone under your command. You can't blame yourself for accidents, Doc. I learned that the hard way in Vietnam. His voice carried the weight of 47 years of survivor's guilt. My whole squad got wiped out in an ambush near Da Nang. I was the only one who made it out alive, and for the longest time I couldn't figure out why God chose me over kids like Tommy Nguyen, who had a wife and baby waiting back home. Sarah Beth stared at her phone screen, where Emma's latest message glowed like an accusation. Mom, I sent you the wedding invitation 3 weeks ago. I know you're somewhere in Africa, but could you at least acknowledge that your only daughter is getting married? Jake's family keeps asking where you are, and I don't know what to tell them anymore. I missed her college graduation for a story in Syria, Sarah Beth admitted, her thumb hovering over the reply button for the 100th time. Missed her 21st birthday for an assignment in Afghanistan. Missed Christmas for 3 years running because there was always some crisis somewhere that seemed more important than my own daughter's life. She looked at the Lionesses maintaining their vigil around Scar, never leaving his side despite the danger. Animals are better parents than I am. Victor had been making encrypted satellite calls throughout the evening, speaking in what he claimed was Russian but sounded increasingly like coded English to Frank's trained ear. His behavior had grown more agitated as the hours passed, checking his expensive watch every few minutes as if working against some invisible deadline. "The pharmaceutical research I mentioned," Victor said during one of his brief returns to the campfire. "It's more urgent than I initially indicated. There are clinical trials beginning in 3 weeks that could revolutionize AIDS treatment. This pride represents genetic material that could save millions of lives." He paused, studying Maggie's haggard face in the firelight. Surely someone battling cancer understands the importance of medical breakthroughs, regardless of the cost. Frank's military instincts had been screaming warnings all evening. Victor's equipment was too sophisticated for academic research, his timing too convenient, his knowledge of their exact location impossible unless he'd been tracking them. More troubling was the way he spoke about Scar and the Lionesses, not as individual animals, but as valuable commodities to be harvested. The trapped lion's condition had visibly deteriorated throughout the night. His breathing had become labored, and the swelling around the steel snare had turned an ominous dark color that spoke of advancing infection. The 5 lionesses had organized themselves into shifts, taking turns to bring him water-soaked vegetation and to groom his matted mane. Their behavior defied everything Maggie knew about lion social structure. "The lead female, I'm calling her Amara, she's making decisions for the entire pride," Maggie observed, her scientific training warring with growing emotional investment. "She's coordinating their hunting schedules, their guard rotations, even their water collection. It's unprecedented cooperative behavior, more sophisticated than anything documented in the literature." As dawn approached, Victor's phone rang with increasing frequency. His conversations had grown heated, punctuated by phrases like timeline acceleration and extraction window. Frank caught fragments that sounded more like military operations than research protocols, and his unease had crystallized into certainty that they were dealing with something far more dangerous than pharmaceutical research. Sarah Beth had been filming everything, her journalist's instincts telling her this was the story of a lifetime if she could stay alive long enough to tell it. Through her camera lens, she watched the lioness's vigil with growing amazement. Mama, the largest female, had brought her 2 6-month-old cubs closer to the group despite the obvious danger. Scout, the one-eyed lioness, had positioned herself as sentinel while the others rested. Little, the smallest and youngest, had claimed the position closest to Scar, grooming his wounds with a tenderness that brought tears to Sarah Beth's eyes. "They're not just protecting him," she realized aloud, reviewing her footage. "They're nursing him back to health. This isn't just loyalty, it's love." She thought of Emma's wedding invitation, of all the moments of love she'd been too busy to notice, and felt something break inside her chest. During the pre-dawn hours, when the camp had finally settled into exhausted quiet, Frank noticed Victor making one final phone call. This time, his voice carried the urgency of a man receiving orders rather than giving updates. When he returned to the campfire, his demeanor had changed completely. The facade of academic researcher had been replaced by something harder and more dangerous. "I'm afraid circumstances have changed," Victor announced, his hand resting casually on what Frank now recognized as a military-grade sidearm. "My associates will be arriving within hours to collect the specimens. I strongly suggest you gather your equipment and return to base camp immediately." "Specimens?" Maggie's voice cracked with outrage. "You're talking about a family. Those lionesses have maintained a vigil for 18 hours straight. They're demonstrating emotional intelligence and cooperative behavior that could revolutionize our understanding of animal consciousness, and you want to turn them into laboratory subjects?" The moral complexity of the situation hit Frank like a physical blow. Here was a man claiming to work toward curing diseases that killed millions, including the cancer that was slowly murdering the woman who'd become like a daughter to him. But the method, capturing and likely killing 6 magnificent lions who were demonstrating the kind of loyalty and sacrifice that Frank had rarely seen in human soldiers, felt like a betrayal of everything decent in the world. Sarah Beth's phone buzzed with another message from Emma. "Mom, I know you probably won't see this before the wedding, but I wanted you to know that I love you anyway. I hope whatever story you're chasing is worth missing your daughter's wedding day. I really hope it is." The timestamp showed it had been sent 3 hours ago. Emma's wedding was in 6 days, and Sarah Beth was 72 hours from the nearest airport with no guarantee of rescue. As the sun crested the horizon, painting the Serengeti in shades of gold and crimson, the sound of helicopter rotors began to echo across the grassland. Victor smiled for the first time since his arrival, a predator's expression that promised violence to anyone who interfered with his plans. "My associates have arrived," he said, checking his weapon with practiced efficiency. "I suggest you say goodbye to your research subjects, Dr. Thompson. Their contribution to medical science begins today." The helicopter descended through the morning heat like a mechanical vulture, its rotors churning dust devils across the golden grassland. Frank's military training kicked in automatically as he counted personnel, 6 armed men in tactical gear, moving with the precision of professional soldiers rather than research assistants. These weren't scientists, they were mercenaries equipped for live animal capture on an industrial scale. Victor's transformation was complete now, the academic facade discarded like yesterday's newspaper. He barked orders in crisp English to the team leader, a scarred man who carried himself with the bearing of ex-military. "Tranquilize the male first, then contain the females. Corporate wants all 6 specimens alive and undamaged for the initial testing phase." "Specimens?" Maggie's voice shook with a rage that surprised even herself. "Those aren't specimens, they're a family." She stepped protectively toward the lions, her small frame dwarfed by the enormity of what she was trying to prevent. "That lioness has been bringing water to her injured mate for 20 hours straight. The cubs are still nursing. You're talking about destroying something that took nature millions of years to create." Sarah Beth's finger hovered over the record button on her phone, torn between documenting what might be her final story and calling for help that would never arrive in time. Emma's wedding invitation seemed to burn through her backpack. 6 days until her daughter walked down the aisle, and Sarah Beth was about to die in the African wilderness for lions she'd known for less than 2 days. The tactical team spread out in a practiced formation, their tranquilizer guns loaded with enough sedative to drop a rhino. Frank recognized the movement patterns from Vietnam. These men had done this before, systematically and efficiently. His purple heart felt heavy against his chest as he calculated odds that reminded him uncomfortably of Firebase Charlie in 1971. "Stand down, old man," the team leader called out, his weapon trained on Frank's chest. "This is a legal operation sanctioned by the Tanzanian Ministry of Natural Resources. These animals are being relocated for conservation purposes." Frank's laugh was bitter as week-old coffee. "Conservation my ass. I've seen enough bullshit operations to recognize one when it's staring me in the face." He thought of Tommy Nguyen dying in his arms, calling for his mother in 2 languages while superior officers talked about acceptable losses for the greater good. "You want these lions, you'll have to go through me first." The Lionesses seemed to sense the escalating danger, their formation tightening around the trapped Scar. Amara, the lead female, positioned herself directly between the armed men and her injured mate, her golden eyes reflecting an intelligence that made Sarah Beth's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. The 2 cubs pressed against their mother's flanks while Scout and Little flanked the group, creating a living fortress of claws and courage. Victor pulled his satellite phone, speaking in rapid-fire commands to someone who was clearly his superior. "Yes, sir. I understand the timeline. The specimens are secured, but we have civilian interference. Dr. Thompson is proving uncooperative." He paused, listening to instructions that made his face harden. "Understood. Minimal collateral damage, but the priority is specimen extraction." Maggie felt something cold settle in her stomach as she recognized the military terminology. Collateral damage. Specimen extraction. These weren't words used by researchers. They were the language of war applied to conservation, and she and her companions had somehow stumbled into the crossfire. "You want to know about medical breakthroughs?" Frank called out, his voice carrying across the tension-thick air. "I'll tell you about breakthroughs. They told us Agent Orange was safe, told us depleted uranium was harmless, told us experimental vaccines would protect us from biological weapons." His hands shook with more than age as he raised the tranquilizer gun. 47 years later, I'm still waiting for those breakthroughs to fix what they broke." The team leader's patience evaporated like morning dew. "Last warning, grandfather. Drop the weapon or we drop you." Sarah Beth made a decision that would define the rest of her life. Instead of filming, she hit the live stream button on her CNN mobile app, broadcasting their situation to whatever satellite coverage might reach this remote corner of Tanzania. "This is Sarah Beth Williams reporting live from the Serengeti, where armed mercenaries are attempting to capture a pride of lions for illegal medical experimentation." Her phone showed 3 viewers, then 17, then suddenly the number began climbing exponentially as social media algorithms picked up keywords like lions, armed men, and live danger. Emma's name appeared in the comments section. "Mom? Mom, what's happening? Where are you?" Victor's face went white as he realized the implications. "Cut that feed immediately." He lunged toward Sarah Beth, but Frank stepped between them, his 72-year-old body moving with muscle memory from a war fought half a century ago. The confrontation exploded into chaos as the team leader fired a tranquilizer dart that caught Frank in the shoulder. The old veteran stumbled but didn't fall, his free hand reaching for the emergency flare gun in his belt. "For Tommy Nguyen and every soldier who died believing in something bigger than themselves." The flare screamed across the morning sky like a crimson prayer, its smoke trail visible for miles across the flat grassland. More importantly, it triggered the emergency protocol at the nearby Tanzanian Wildlife Authority station, automatically dispatching rangers to investigate distress signals. Maggie watched Frank collapse, the tranquilizer finally overwhelming his determination. In that moment, something fundamental shifted inside her. The careful scientist, who had spent decades observing from a distance, suddenly became a mother protecting her cubs. She rushed toward the trapped lion, putting herself between Scar and the advancing mercenaries. "You want him?" she screamed, her voice carrying across the Serengeti with surprising power. "You'll have to kill a dying woman first. I've got 6 months to live, maybe less." "What's the worst you can do to me that cancer hasn't already started?" The lionesses seemed to understand that the humans were fighting for them rather than against them. Amara made a sound that was almost conversational, a low, rumbling vocalization that Frank had heard between family members sharing information. The other lionesses responded in kind, their formation shifting to include the humans within their protective circle. Sarah Beth's live stream had exploded to over 50,000 viewers as news networks began picking up the feed. Comments flooded in from around the world, offers of help, demands for government intervention, and most importantly, real-time location data being shared with Tanzanian authorities. The team leader received new orders through his earpiece, his face darkening as he listened. Corporate priorities had shifted, the operation was blown, international attention was mounting, and the risk of diplomatic incidents was escalating beyond acceptable parameters. 30 seconds to extraction, he announced to his team. Take what we can get and abort. He raised his weapon toward the trapped lion, but Victor grabbed his arm. "Wait," Victor said, his voice carrying an emotion that hadn't been there before. Something about Maggie's defiant stand had cracked his professional composure. There might be another way. The tranquilizer dart hit Frank with the force of betrayal itself. The chemical cocktail designed for 400-pound lions flooding through his 72-year-old cardiovascular system like liquid fire. He collapsed beside the trapped lion, his Purple Heart medal catching the morning light as his chest rose and fell in increasingly shallow breaths. The irony wasn't lost on him. After surviving Firebase Charlie, Agent Orange exposure, and 47 years of survivor's guilt, he was dying in defense of animals who couldn't understand his sacrifice. Maggie dropped to her knees beside Frank's unconscious form, her hands trembling as she checked his pulse. The chemotherapy had weakened her own system, but adrenaline and rage kept her functional as she watched the man who'd become like a father figure struggle against an overdose meant for a creature 10 times his size. "You bastards," she whispered, her voice carrying across the Serengeti with surprising venom. "He's a 72-year-old veteran with a heart condition. That dose could kill him." Sarah Beth's live stream had exploded to over 200,000 viewers worldwide. The comment section a blur of outrage, support, and desperate offers of help. But what caught her attention was a single message that made her blood freeze. "Sarah Beth Williams, this is your daughter Emma. I'm watching this live from Minneapolis. Mom, please don't die for a story. Please. The wedding can wait. I need you to come home." The words hit harder than any tranquilizer dart. Emma had called her mom for the first time in 3 years, and it was because she thought Sarah Beth was about to die. The realization that her daughter still loved her, despite years of neglect and broken promises, shattered something inside Sarah Beth's chest that had nothing to do with the immediate danger. Victor knelt beside Frank, his professional mask finally cracking completely as he administered emergency medical aid with the skill of someone trained in combat medicine. "His pulse is erratic," he announced, his voice carrying genuine concern for the first time since his arrival. "The dosage was calculated for lion physiology. In a man his age with his medical history, we're looking at potential cardiac arrest." The 5 lionesses had formed a protective circle around both Frank and the trapped Scar, their behavior defying every scientific principle Maggie had studied in 40 years of research. Amara, the lead female, had positioned herself directly over Frank's unconscious form, her massive paws flanking his shoulders as if she could shield him from further harm. The sight of apex predators protecting a human who had been trying to save them created a visual that Sarah Beth knew would haunt her for the rest of her life. Mama, the lioness with cubs, had done something unprecedented. She'd brought her 6-month-old babies closer to the humans rather than farther away, as if recognizing that the real threat came from the armed mercenaries, not from the people who'd spent the night keeping vigil with her pride. Her cubs played at Frank's feet, their innocent movements a stark contrast to the life-or-death drama unfolding around them. The team leader's patience had evaporated completely. "Corporate wants results, not complications," he snarled into his radio. "Execute the extraction protocol now, with or without the old man." He raised his weapon toward Scar, but the Lionesses' protective formation made a clean shot impossible without risking injury to Frank, who lay directly in the line of fire. Maggie made a decision that would define her final months on Earth. She crawled toward the steel trap holding Scar, her hands working at the mechanism with the desperate efficiency of a woman who had nothing left to lose. "I've spent 40 years studying lion behavior from a safe distance," she called out to Sarah Beth's streaming audience. "But sometimes the only way to understand something is to become part of it." The trapped lion watched her approach with eyes that seemed almost human in their intelligence. Despite his pain and exhaustion, Scar remained perfectly still as Maggie's trembling fingers worked at the trap's release mechanism. The trust implicit in his behavior, a wild predator allowing a human to touch his injured leg, created a moment of interspecies connection that transcended scientific observation. Frank's breathing became increasingly labored, each inhalation a struggle against the tranquilizer overdose. His lips had taken on a bluish tinge that Maggie recognized from her late husband's final days in hospice care. The man who had survived Vietnam, buried his wife, and chosen to spend his final years helping others was dying because he'd tried to protect animals he'd known for less than 24 hours. Sarah Beth watched her viewer count climb past 500,000 as major news networks began picking up her feed. But all she could think about was Emma's message, about the wedding she might never attend, about the grandchildren she might never meet. The Lionesses' vigil around Frank had become a symbol of the devotion Sarah Beth had never shown her own family. The sound of approaching vehicles echoed across the grassland, Tanzanian Wildlife Authority rangers responding to Frank's emergency flare, still 20 minutes away but closing fast. Too late to save Frank, but perhaps in time to save the lions who had tried to save him. The sound that came from Victor's throat wasn't quite a sob, but it carried 15 years of suppressed grief as he knelt beside Frank's unconscious form. His hands shook as he administered CPR with the precision of someone who'd done this before, in circumstances that had haunted him every day since. "Come on, old man," he whispered, his carefully constructed accent finally slipping to reveal the flat vowels of rural Minnesota. "Don't you die on me. Not like this. Not again." Maggie's hands froze on the trap mechanism as recognition hit her like a physical blow. The voice, the way his hands moved, the stubborn set of his jaw when he was concentrating, details she'd memorized from watching a 15-year-old boy work with injured animals in their backyard clinic. "Marcus." The name escaped her lips as barely more than breath, but it carried 40 years of unanswered prayers. Victor, Marcus, looked up from Frank's still form, and for a moment the mercenary facade cracked completely, revealing the lost boy who'd disappeared during a climbing expedition that had never happened. "Hello, Mom," he said simply, his pale blue eyes, Robert's eyes, their father's eyes, filling with tears he'd been holding back for 15 years. Sarah Beth's camera captured every second of the reunion, her live stream audience climbing past 700,000 as the world watched a mother discover her presumed dead son in the most impossible circumstances. The comments section exploded with disbelief, joy, and growing outrage as viewers began to understand the true scope of what they were witnessing. "You've been alive this whole time?" Maggie's voice cracked with a pain that transcended the physical agony of cancer. "I buried an empty coffin. I sold our house to pay for memorial services." I've spent 15 years believing I killed my own child by bringing him to Africa." Her hands trembled so violently she couldn't continue working on the trap. "Why? Why would you let me think you were dead?" Marcus continued chest compressions on Frank while tears streamed down his face. "I was in debt to people who would have hurt you to get to me. Gambling, drugs. I was a mess, Mom. The climbing accident was my way out, my chance to disappear and protect you from the mistakes I'd made." He paused, checking Frank's pulse with growing desperation. "I never meant for it to be permanent. I was going to come back when I'd cleaned up my life, when I had something to offer besides shame." The team leader's radio crackled with increasingly urgent orders from corporate headquarters. The live stream had been picked up by CNN, BBC, and major networks worldwide. Government officials in 3 countries were demanding explanations, and the pharmaceutical company's stock price was in freefall as investors absorbed the implications of illegal animal experimentation. "Abort the mission," came the final order. "All teams extract immediately. Leave no evidence of corporate involvement." But Marcus had stopped listening to his handlers. Frank's pulse was becoming weaker, the old veteran's body shutting down from the tranquilizer overdose. "He's going into cardiac arrest," Marcus announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone with extensive medical training. "Sarah Beth, call for emergency medical evacuation. Now." "The nearest hospital is 200 kilometers away," Sarah Beth replied, her phone in one hand and camera in the other. "Even if they send a helicopter, it'll be 45 minutes minimum." She looked at her viewer count. Over 1 million people now, watching in real time as an American war hero died trying to save African lions. The Lionesses seemed to understand that Frank was dying. Amara had positioned herself so that her massive body provided shade for his unconscious form, while Scout had begun a low, rhythmic vocalization that sounded almost like a funeral song. The cubs, sensing their mother's distress, had grown quiet and still, their usual playfulness replaced by a solemnity that seemed impossible in such young animals. Maggie finally managed to release the trap mechanism, the steel jaws opening with a metallic clang that echoed across the Serengeti. Scar, free for the first time in 24 hours, struggled to his feet on trembling legs. But instead of fleeing, the massive lion limped toward Frank's unconscious form, lowering his great head to sniff the man who had tried to save him. 15 years, Maggie whispered, her hands touching her son's face as if to confirm he was real. 15 years I've been dying inside, believing I'd failed as a mother. The cancer started 6 months after your memorial service. The doctor said stress could be a trigger, but I knew better. I knew it was guilt eating me alive from the inside." Marcus's professional composure finally shattered completely. "I watched your interviews online, saw the research papers you dedicated to my memory. I saw you win the Conservation Society Award and thank your angel son in your acceptance speech." His voice broke as he continued CPR. "I wanted to come home so many times, but the pharmaceutical company owned me by then. They had evidence of the fake death, could have sent me to prison for insurance fraud. I was trapped just like these lions." The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder. Not the corporate extraction team, but Tanzanian Wildlife Authority rangers, and, impossibly, a medical evacuation helicopter dispatched by the American Embassy after Sarah Beth's live stream had reached government officials in Washington. The power of viral media was reshaping reality in real time. Frank's eyes fluttered open, his gaze finding Marcus's face with surprising clarity. "Son," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the approaching rotors, "sometimes the best thing you can do is come home. Doesn't matter how long you've been gone, doesn't matter what mistakes you made. Family is family." The old veteran's hand found Maggie's with surprising strength. "Doc, I need you to listen to me. Betty used to say that love doesn't have an expiration date. It just waits for us to remember how to use it. His eyes moved to Marcus, then to Sarah Beth. Don't let fear steal what time you have left. Any of you. Scar, the massive lion who had been trapped for over 24 hours, did something that would be studied by animal behaviorists for decades to come. He lowered his great head and gently touched Frank's forehead with his nose, a gesture so tender and deliberate that Sarah Beth's live stream audience began flooding the comments with wonder and disbelief. The 5 lionesses formed a circle around the dying man and the reunited family, their presence both protective and ceremonial. As the medical helicopter landed 50 meters away, churning dust into golden clouds, the lions maintained their vigil. Apex predators, showing a respect for human courage that transcended species boundaries. Marcus looked at his mother, at Frank, at the lions they'd all been willing to die to protect, and made the decision that would define the rest of his life. "I'm done running," he announced to the world through Sarah Beth's camera. "My name is Marcus Thompson. I've been dead for 15 years, and it's time to come home." The pharmaceutical company's extraction team retreated as Tanzanian rangers arrived, their corporate mission abandoned in the face of international scrutiny and a viral video that had shown the world what courage looked like. 6 months after the world watched a family reunite in the shadow of 5 lionesses, Dr. Margaret Thompson sat in the oncology wing of the Mayo Clinic, her silver hair grown back in soft curls that caught the Minnesota winter sunlight streaming through hospital windows. The experimental treatment, funded by an unprecedented GoFundMe campaign, now exceeding $3 million from donors worldwide, had pushed her pancreatic cancer into remission for the first time in 18 months. The latest scans show continued reduction in tumor markers, Dr. Harrison explained, his smile genuine as he reviewed her charts. "Whatever happened to you in Africa, Mrs. Thompson, it seems to have given your immune system the fight it needed." He paused, studying the data that defied medical expectations. "Your stress levels have dropped dramatically, your sleep patterns have normalized, and your body is responding to treatment better than patients half your age." Maggie knew the medical miracle had less to do with experimental drugs and more to do with the healing power of hope restored. Marcus sat beside her hospital bed, his hand covering hers as they watched news coverage of the pharmaceutical company's bankruptcy proceedings on the wall-mounted television. The executives responsible for the illegal lion capture operation were facing federal charges, while the corporation's $50 million fine had been donated to African wildlife conservation. "Mom, you've got visitors," Marcus announced, his voice carrying the wonder of someone still adjusting to using that word again. Through the hospital room window, they could see Frank Morrison walking across the parking lot with his characteristic military bearing, now accompanied by a young woman with Sarah Beth's determined stride and her grandmother's gentle eyes. Frank had made a full recovery from the tranquilizer overdose, though his doctors maintained it was the fastest cardiac rehabilitation they'd ever documented. He credited his recovery to having too much left to do to die yet, which included formally adopting Marcus as his son and establishing the Morrison-Thompson Wildlife Foundation with funds from his late wife's life insurance policy. "Well, if it isn't my favorite troublemakers," Frank announced as he entered the room, Emma Williams Morrison close behind. The former CNN journalist had taken her new husband's name after a wedding ceremony that had drawn international media attention, partly because it was held at the Minnesota Zoo's Africa exhibit, but mostly because it represented the healing of a family that had found each other again through the courage of African lions. Emma carried a tablet showing live footage from the Serengeti, where the Thompson-Morrison Wildlife Sanctuary had been established around the exact location where Scar's pride still thrived. The massive male lion, fully recovered from his ordeal, now led a pride of 15 members, including 5 new cubs born just 2 months earlier. Conservation biologists from around the world made pilgrimages to study the behavioral anomalies first documented in Sarah Beth's viral live stream. "The cubs are getting bigger," Emma reported, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who'd found her calling documenting wildlife rather than war zones. Dr. Kamani says Amara's teaching them to recognize human vehicles versus poacher vehicles. It's like she's passing down the memory of what happened that day. She paused the video on an image of Scar, his distinctive facial scar now legendary among conservationists worldwide. "And look what arrived this morning." She switched to a new video feed showing construction crews building a state-of-the-art research facility on the edge of the sanctuary. The Thomson-Morrison Research Station would be the first facility designed specifically to study interspecies emotional intelligence, funded by donations that continued pouring in from the millions who'd watched a dying war veteran protected by lions while a mother reunited with her presumed dead son. Sarah Beth's latest documentary just won the Academy Award for Best Feature Documentary, Frank announced, pulling up the acceptance speech on his phone. She dedicated it to the lions who taught us that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's love acting despite fear. He looked at Maggie with eyes that had regained their twinkle. Course, she also said she learned more about family in 3 days with lions than in 20 years as a war correspondent. Marcus squeezed his mother's hand, still amazed that she was alive to hear these updates. The experimental treatment had been controversial, using synthesized proteins derived from African lion immune systems to boost human cancer resistance. The irony that Marcus's former pharmaceutical company had been unknowingly developing the treatment that would save his mother wasn't lost on any of them. "There's something else," Emma said, her voice carrying the nervous excitement of someone about to share life-changing news. "Jake and I went for our first ultrasound yesterday." She pulled out a sonogram image, the grainy black-and-white photograph showing 2 distinct forms. Twins. A boy and a girl. She looked at Maggie with tears in her eyes. "We'd like to name them Scar and Amara, if that's okay with their great-grandmother." The hospital room fell silent, except for the distant sound of Minneapolis traffic and the steady beep of monitoring equipment that had become the soundtrack of Maggie's recovery. She studied the sonogram image, seeing the future of a family that had been scattered across continents and decades, but had somehow found its way back together through the wisdom of lions. "Your great-great-grandfather would have loved this," Maggie whispered, thinking of her own father who'd first inspired her love of animals during childhood visits to the Como Zoo. "He always said that every generation should leave the world a little wilder than they found it." She looked around the room at faces that represented every age of her life. The son she'd lost and found, the surrogate father who'd saved them all, the daughter-in-law who'd documented their miracle, and the great-daughter who carried their legacy forward. Frank's phone buzzed with a video call from Tanzania. Dr. Jengo Kimani, the Maasai researcher who'd taken over day-to-day operations of the sanctuary, appeared on screen with the golden Serengeti stretching behind him. "Jambo, my friends," he called out in accented English. "I have news from your lions." The camera panned to show Scar leading his pride toward a waterhole, his powerful frame moving with the confidence of an apex predator who'd survived human cruelty and been saved by human courage. The 5 lionesses followed in formation, their cubs playing at their feet, in the kind of scene that had inspired countless nature documentaries, but never quite like this. "Something extraordinary happened this morning," Dr. Kamani continued. "A film crew arrived to document the anniversary of the rescue, and Amara did something we've never seen before." The camera zoomed in on the lead lioness, who was approaching a group of tourists with deliberate purpose. She walked directly to an elderly man in a wheelchair, a veteran visiting from America, and touched her nose to his hand, just like she did with Frank that day. The implications hung in the air like incense in a cathedral. Somehow, the lioness had recognized something in a human stranger that connected him to the man who'd saved her family. The behavior suggested a level of emotional intelligence and memory that would require textbooks to be rewritten. "There's more," Dr. Kimani added, his voice filled with wonder. When the man began crying, apparently his grandson died in Afghanistan last year, the entire pride surrounded his wheelchair. 15 lions, creating the same protective formation they used when Frank was dying. They stayed with him for 2 hours, until his tour group was ready to leave. Maggie closed her eyes, feeling the weight of scientific discovery and spiritual miracle settling over her like a blanket. The lions weren't just remembering a specific incident. They were recognizing pain in human beings and responding with compassion that transcended species boundaries. It was the kind of breakthrough that would define conservation efforts for the next century. "We're going back," she announced suddenly, her decision surprising everyone, including herself. "The cancer's in remission, Marcus is home safe, and there's still work to do." She looked at her family, biological and chosen, human and animal, with the clarity of someone who'd been given a second chance at everything. "Frank, you once told me that love doesn't have an expiration date. Well, neither does purpose." The room erupted in excited planning, but through the window Maggie could see African sunset colors painting the Minnesota sky. Somewhere in the Serengeti, 5 lionesses were teaching their cubs that humans could be protectors as well as predators, while an old lion with a scarred face led his pride toward whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. Love, Maggie realized, really didn't have an expiration date. It just waited for brave hearts to remember how to use it. Sometimes life's greatest gifts come wrapped in our deepest fears. For Dr. Margaret Thompson at 68, facing terminal cancer meant confronting a lifetime of regrets. Losing her son, Marcus, missing precious moments, feeling like she'd failed as a mother. But in the African wilderness, surrounded by 5 lionesses protecting their injured mate, she discovered something profound. Love doesn't have an expiration date, and it's never too late for second chances. Frank Morrison, a 72-year-old Vietnam veteran carrying decades of survivor's guilt, found his purpose wasn't finished. Sarah Beth Williams learned that the most important story she'd ever tell wasn't about war or politics. It was about coming home to family. These 3 Americans, each believing their best years were behind them, discovered that courage grows stronger with age, that wisdom earned through loss becomes a gift to others, and that sometimes protecting something vulnerable gives our lives the meaning we've been searching for. Their story reminds us that every sunset can also be a sunrise, that the bonds we forge in our later years often become our strongest, and that sometimes the family we choose becomes as precious as the family we're born into. Age isn't about what we've lost, it's about what we've learned to cherish. What second chance are you still hoping for? How has protecting something or someone you love given your life deeper meaning?